Hello, everybody. All right, welcome to the Mikestand. Today is, of course, Friday, July the 18th, 2025. Of course, we're going to still give people a chance to come in before we start. Hopefully, everybody had a good week this week. Let's see. If you haven't already, if you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream, see if we get some more friendly people in here to engage, that'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions, and I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. Oh, anyways, so I did continue watching some cartoons from, well, some cartoons and actually some live action stuff because there's a couple of commercials, a couple of animated commercials in the mix this time, January 1939. Also, um, apparently they'd even put up a cartoon about how Walt Disney made his cartoons. So that was it wasn't a cartoon, but it was more of a live action thing. But pretty interesting stuff. Saw, of course, Doggone Modern as well, which was the first installment of first Merry installment featuring the two curious puppies. So, marking the third set of characters, along with Egghead, the proto Elmer Fudd, and Happy Rabbit, the proto Bugs Bunny, to be featured on Merry Melodies. So, anyways, okay, so let's see, 2 minutes here. What else is there to talk about? Let's see. Well, okay, I guess I'll just go ahead and just talk about what's on tap for it. So, I mean, I'm going to go over one article tonight from Bleeding Fool. Um, they say you should never speak ill of the dead, but apparently there are some people who didn't get that memo, as the social justice mob is apparently now starting to cry recently passed Jim Shooter, the late great Jim Shooter. We'll get a look at that. Also, of course, we're getting caught up on all the latest in professional wrestling. Look back to last night's TNA Impact and Ring of Honor shows. And of course, last night's Impact was the go home Impact before this Sunday's Slammiversary event. We'll also look ahead to tonight's SmackDown as well as tomorrow night's Collision and this Sunday's Slammiversary, and then wrap things up with this day in Neat's history. So again, if you guys haven't already, you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream. See if we can get some more friendly people in here to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions. I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. With that being said, why don't we go ahead and get started then? Let me go ahead and pull. And part of the reason why we're going to do just one article, because this particular article, from what I saw, was going to take quite a bit of time to go through. So, probably the majority of the show. So, with that being said, let's get into this. So, social justice mob tearing down the late great Jim Shooter, article by Avi Green, published July 16, 2025, which of course is this past Wednesday. So, let's get into this. No sooner did the news of Jim Shooter's passing come out, shortly afterwards, as this based-looking bleeding cool article says, there's LGBT advocates tearing down on Shooter, accusing him of homophobia over the story he oversaw in The Rampaging Hulk, title around 1980, involving two homosexual rapists threatening Bruce Banner at a YMCA club. This week saw the passing of Jim Shooter, writer, artist, editor, publisher, and editor-in-chief at Marvel, Valiant, Defiant, and Broadway comics. Among all the tributes made to the man and his impact on the comic book industry, caused it, as Bleeding Cool described it, to quote unquote grow up. There are plenty of anecdotes that swing all over the place regarding the man. And more often than not, as well as discussion about the rules, they're using the word quote unquote complicated. Former Marvel DC writer, editor, and gay activist, founder of the Gays in Comics panel at San Diego Comic Con, and for years the most prominent out creator in mainstream comics, Andy Mangels, which of course I've never heard of this guy before. So just saying, he's supposedly a pretty well-known guy, but picked up on that yesterday, posting to Facebook an article he wrote for Amazing Heroes about gay culture and comics back in the 90s, and then posting further. Quote, regarding Jim Shooter's death, I'm seeing a lot of tributes and a lot of them using the word complicated, quote unquote. Well, I'll add one more word, homophobic, in Rampaging Hulk magazine in 1980. Okay, let's all take a little look back in history there. 1980, there weren't a lot of out people at that time. So, to go back and call a man homophobic at a time when there weren't even a lot of people who were out. Yeah, that's but then again, a lot of these people also probably would find the story of Sodom and Gomorrah homophobic. Okay, so just saying. They'd probably find Leviticus 18:22 homophobic. So, anyways, Shooter wrote a damning story about Bruce Banner almost being arped at the YMCA by two lisping, mincing queens. Now this guy is the one calling these guys queens, I guess. But again, so horrific was it that it made newspaper and magazine stories at the time, in brackets Advocate, Village Voice, and Omni among them. So I'm guessing those particular magazines are pro gay, pro LGBT, I guess. But anyways, I later wrote about it in Amazing Heroes number 143 and number 144, and again in The Advocate. Throughout the years, Shooter was alternately defensively angry about people's reactions to the blatantly awful story. I don't know. Well, was there people who agreed with this guy, Andy Mangel? Again, Andy Mandels or Mangels, whatever his name is. I personally have never heard of the guy before. Don't know how many people have, but on his blog, in parentheses here, especially in the comments, he defended it even against the words of gay ex-Marvel editor Roger Cloris, unquote. So this Avi's response to it was, obviously I was giving my own response to what I was reading there. Let's see what Avi has to say about what we just read there. See what Avi has to say here. I wonder if this is the same kind of disposition strongly hinted at would have been said if Shooter had published a story about lesbian rapists. Speaking of lesbians, you don't usually see this kind of fuss made about Mystique and Destiny, the two villainesses who led the Brother of Evil Brotherhood of Evil Mutants during the 80s. Otherwise, they wouldn't have lasted beyond a few issues. They even made it to the drawing board. That said, this Mangles um, sounds like quite an entitled ideologue who doesn't want to recognize that LGBT can do bad things. Mm-hmm. And that's what the story was about, as explained in the following coming from his blog at the time. First, the query was asked. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, even by Christian standards, people in the LGBT are not angels. Okay, they're human, but quote, I would love to know more about was your involvement in the Hulk magazine number 23, the story where Bruce Banner is nearly ARPed in a YMCA shower. From memory, the story was quite controversial and resulted in an outpouring of mostly negative letters that were published in the letters column for 2 issues. I would love to know what your inspiration to write the story was and the fallout that occurred afterwards. Shooter's answer was, quote, a friend of mine at the age of 15, maybe 16, not sure, had been attacked in exactly the same way at the McBurney Y, and escaped as Banner did. That scene was a small bit, not by a long shot, the focus of the story. I was a charter subscriber to New Woman magazine, which had run a series of articles about ARP, and in particular one about, quote, post-ARP syndrome, unquote. Many ARP victims are in shock during the actual attack, almost numb and disbelieving. Their reactions, anger, horror, humiliation, the whole emotional gamut often do not set in until afterward. I thought, what if, for once, Banner did not turn into the Hulk when it was convenient, but only afterwards, when the reactions set in, when it wasn't convenient. The bad guys, to me, were just that, bad guys. Basically, I think what he's saying there is, didn't matter if they were homosexual or not. They were committing a crime. They were committing assault, attempting to ARP another man. So, I mean, that's not being homophobic. That's, that's, it's funny how they a lot of these people in the LGBT, a lot of these activists want their rights and want their recognition, want to come out of the quote unquote closet. But with that, you also have to face the consequences of your actions. And somebody who's in the LGBT, just because they're LGBT doesn't make them less likely to commit crimes or commit assault or anything like that than somebody who's straight. Marvel was an equal opportunity employer. Anyone could be a bad guy. It never occurred to me that a couple of bad guys could be interpreted as a sweeping indictment of gay people. As far as I know, we received a total of 6 letters regarding that issue. 2 positive, 2 neutral, 2 negative. So it was a pretty balanced reaction. So whatever the guy who was, asking him about it, I don't know if he was one of the 2 negative reactions or one of the 2 neutrals, but 6 letters in total and only 2 were really negative. That doesn't sound like a huge outcry to me. I don't know. I think for most people, I don't think that would sound like a huge outcry. So, let's see. I'm just trying to remember. Okay. I believe we printed all of them. I wrote personal replies to the negative ones. The comment I received that meant the most to me was Stan's. He was worried when he heard about the story. In particular, he was worried that it might offend the producers of the Hulk TV show. Then he read it. He called me, quote, or in parentheses here, he was in LA, and said it was the best comic stories he ever read. Now, I could see why the people from the Hulk, especially if it was from the animated Hulk TV show, because, you know, I would think the potential problem if he's publishing a comic, grant, by the 80s, of course, by 1980, comics were generally considered, you know, being published for kids. So to, even in the way that Shooter put it, putting a story about somebody getting arced would probably not go over well with the parents of children who would have been reading that story, right? There were a lot more parents back in 1980 who would not have wanted their kids to be reading that. We still have quite a few parents today who don't want their kids reading that or kids being exposed to that. Okay? It doesn't mean you're homophobic. It's like, one of the things I always point out is that kids don't need a lot of stuff that some of the people in the mainstream media and the left seem to be pushing, especially onto kids, doesn't need to be pushed. This isn't, to me, this isn't a straight thing or a gay thing or anything like that. Kids kids under the age of 10, under the age of 13, don't need to know any more about the private parts other than the fact that, one, nobody has a right to touch them, period. And two, the private parts are used to go to the bathroom. That's all they need to know. They don't need to, they don't need to know about two mommies or two daddies or a mommy, a daddy, and a zonk zonk or what have you. All right? That's my take on the whole thing. But, on that. But anyways, I know that's a bit of a digression, but I think it's an important digression. So anyways, continuing on with the article here. So Stan liked the story. Stan didn't find a problem with it. Of course, I think even by today's standards, Stan Lee would probably be considered moderate compared to where we've gone, where the left has gone. Okay, so in fact, some might even consider Stan conservative by today's standards. But anyways, but like Stan Lee, and I know people for his time, a lot of people for his time thought Walt Disney was fairly left wing as well for his time. I've heard some people comment on that. But when it came to kids and what you should be giving them, by today's standards, they'd be considered conservative. Stan, as you know, is prone to hyperbole, but clearly he liked it. He also told me not to worry about the reactions. If any, he said he would stand by the story. So do I, unquote. So that was Jim Shooter's response to the person who wrote him a letter. And I guess it's continuing on with that. Quote, there was spillover into the second issue's letter call comments, letter call, in other words, the letter column. Now, many of you who probably grew up reading comics, well, even when I've gone back and seen the when I've been going over the older comics, there's always been a letter column there for people to write in, dear editor and all that. So letter comments on the comments. A reporter from The Advocate came to interview me. The first thing he asked was why Marvel was anti-gay. I said we weren't. Why then, he asked, didn't we have any gay characters? I said we had lots of them. He asked which ones. I said, quote, you can't tell, can you? Unquote. He folded up his notebook and left. Oh, that's a good response there, Jim. That was a good response. And wrote the story he always intended to write anyway. Now, this is an obvious response to what we just read, in terms of reading not just the initial question, but also Jim Shooter's response to it. So, is there something inherently wrong with wanting to address the fact that homosexual rape, homosexual art exists? Not really. Only in the minds of people who think that it will cause a backlash because but that's their problem. That's what these charlatans seem to be implying. Over here in Israel, there was a scandal involving a LGBT activist who was accused by at least 5 men of ARPing them. And the worst part is that the leftist district attorney refused to indict him, thus throwing his victims under the bus. In the ultra-Orthodox community, there was a scandal involving 2 once revered and now deceased by suicide figures, who it turned out had committed both heterosexual and homosexual ARP. If Mr. Mangles believes it's unacceptable to make a point how nobody, no matter their sexual preference is incapable of committing heinous acts of sexual violence, then he's excusing those particular offenders too. What a disgrace. Here's what Bleeding Cool quoted from Mr. Clarice. This is from the Bleeding Cool article. I'm just trying to check down here, see if we have anybody here. Oh. All right. Quote, in your recollections of the Hulk story, you talk about your handling of the ARP as based on a true incident, as if that somehow absolves you for responsibility for its effect. And you talk about the letters received as, quote, too positive, too neutral, and too negative, unquote. Probably accurate, but oversimplified. And say, quote, I believe we printed all of them. I wrote personal replies to the negative ones, unquote. There's the oversimplification first ever accepting the ARP as a value-neutral story point, which is not easy. You omit the fact that you portray the ARPist as bleak stereotypes right down to the lisping. Quote, "Oh pith," unquote. Second, at a time when there were few, if any, visible gay characters in mainstream comics, presenting ARP as the only same-sex sexual interaction is thoughtless at best. Well, again, there weren't as many out gay people, and there were a lot of people out there who were not like, wanting such things in comics. So, and as for your quote unquote, "you can't tell" witticism, that's the point. Saying that the quote unquote good gay characters are the invisible ones, the ones who can't be seen with a same-sex partner behaving in as a PG, a manner of their opposite sex pairing peers, sends gay and questioning readers a hell of a message. Hide who you are. That's how to be good, quote unquote. Well, that was society back in the 80s, though. Okay, that was society back in the 80s. There's, there is and always will be a segment of society who believe that homosexuality is a sin and is inherently evil. You may not agree with that statement, and that's your right to. But, there are people who believe that. If, of course, they even heard your hushed up message. In parentheses, remember, this is the era in which we first saw Nightwing and Starfire in the sack. Nobody was even asking for that, just a little discreet interaction on the order of the kids in the first few issues of Young Avengers. Parentheses. As for the letters I wrote one of those, and I suppose you're counting it as as negative, since you did reply with basically a quote, "my toys, my rules," unquote response, to the effect of quote, "I told my story, sorry you didn't like it," unquote. Which is true. I mean, again, and we talk a lot about this today too, right? Instead of looking to the big, I mean, if you really want to if you really want to publish a gay story with a gay character, and do it yourself. If you don't like what's being produced, you can always you always find somebody who's doing what you're looking for. You don't have to, you don't have to read Marvel or DC or anything like that. Let's see. But as for the actual printed letter, I wrote a letter praising you for trying to write about more adult topics, but taking you to task for the specifics. Once Ralph Macchio got done with it, okay, and just so you guys know, there was a Marvel, I don't know, writer or artist named Ralph Macchio. This is not the same Ralph Macchio who's the actor who was in Karate Kid. Just so you guys know. Got done with it. Ironic that it should be Ralph, since Marv Wolfman called me just after Ralph was hired and told me he would have hired me for the gig, and I not just gone back to college, but hell, no complaints now. What appeared was the part of the letter praising your efforts. No criticism, unquote. I guess this might be Andy Mangels talking. Now this is what Avi has to. This is Avi's response to what we just read there. So in other words, what he was saying is that even if the story draws from a real life incident, it's still inherently wrong to address the subject. For shame, I realized there were times when Shooter came off. Sounds like, quote, it's everyone else's fault but mine, unquote. But this guy's doing no better. Shooter's reply was the following. Quote, when I wrote that scene, I wasn't thinking about, quote, its effect, unquote, beyond the way it served the story and established critical things about Banner Hulk that were germane. Here's something I would ask the guy who's being, or the people who are being critical for Shooter for being quote unquote homophobic for putting this. Here's a thought. What would your reaction have been if Banner did change into the Hulk? You know, as they were starting or trying to basically assault him, arc him, and the Hulk ended up basically tearing him to shreds. Then what? Are you gonna then try to say, "Oh, the Hulk's homophobic"? Huh? You would have been crying a lot more if that had happened. So, as I said, it never occurred to me that there was any quote unquote effect to worry about. Clearly, there was, and maybe I should have been more aware. Sorry I portrayed the bad guys in that scene as they were described to me by my friend. Call him MJ, with whom I was staying at the McBurney Y. He obviously didn't hear anyone say piff after he escaped. I originally wrote, quote unquote, piss. Worried about using that, I made it, quote unquote, piss, which I could see why, because piss to this day is considered, a curse word for your urine. Lynn Graham, the editor, I always had an editor, specifically mentioned that as being sardonically sinister in character for that bad guy. So I felt it. I'll concede now, in retrospect, that it was a bad idea. Sorry. And continuing with Shooter's reaction here. Quote, when I wrote the story, I wasn't thinking about what was or wasn't going on in mainstream comics. I was thinking about that story. Didn't appear, quote, in mainstream comics anyways. And here's another thing too. Here's another thing that they seem to forget. Albeit it had been relaxed quite a bit. In fact, that's what reminded me seeing the next line here. Albeit relaxed quite a bit, the Comics Code Authority was still in effect at that point in time. So, it appeared in a code-free magazine. I didn't ponder what was going on in mainstream magazines either. I was just trying to write a good story based on experiences I was close to. I wish I'd been smarter, wiser, more conscious of what that little bit might mean in the great context of comics publishing, but I wasn't. The preceding sentence was not written in a snarky way. I mean it. I wasn't as aware as I should have been, or someone better prepared than me might have been. But I was younger then, and so was the world. That's the only excuse I can offer. Sorry as for my, quote, you can't tell, unquote, witticism, as you call it. The point is that I knew the guy was going to write his article as he did. It wasn't an interview, it was a fishing expedition to see if he could get me to say something damning he could use. My quote unquote witticism made it clear I wasn't going to. So he left. You missed the point. I think it's quite a leap to say that I was sending a quote hide who you are message unquote in a statement that wasn't made publicly. Quote, if of course they even heard your hushed up message, unquote. Well, it wasn't a message. There was no message I was sending, except, I suppose, to the Advocate reporter, um, that he wasn't going to get what he wanted out of me. I'm guessing he wanted an Al Campanis style meltdown. Okay, so just to remind people what that was, what Jim Shooter referred to there. So I think it was back sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. Might have been late 70s. Al Campanis, who I believe was, I think he was the GM of either the Dodgers or the Angels. Let me take a quick peek at that. Because I do kind of know the story. Al Campanis was, I think, he was a former baseball player and major league executive. He was Campanis is most famous for his position as general manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers from 1968 to 1987, for which he was fired on April 8, 1987, as a result of controversial remarks regarding black people in baseball made during an interview on Nightline 2 days earlier. So that's what he's referencing there. The Al Campanis interview on Nightline, where he basically went off on what some people would have called like a racist tyrant, back in, I guess, 1987. I think what Jim Shooter was pointing out here was that this reporter from the Advocate was basically going to try to do the same thing, trying to get Shooter to do something, make such a damning statement about gay people that it could have ruined his career. It could have got him like fired and all that. And he wasn't going to fall for the bait, as it were. So, anyways, as we now continue on here, and if you're talking about a message that you think I'm trying to send now by quoting that quote unquote witticism, come on. Here in the 21st century, really? You are correct that most mainstream American comics were still just beginning to deal with sex at all in any way more deeply than seen on I Love Lucy. At first, we mostly weren't very good at dealing with sex of any kind in a more sophisticated, mature, wiser way. I thought the first few attempts at gay relationships done in comics were clumsy and heavy-handed. Slowly, I think we have improved. Unquote. More of what Jim Shooter had to say on it. Quote, I told my story. I'm sorry you didn't like it. I wish I had it back to do over again and make it better. For that matter, I wish I had every story I've ever written back to do over and do better. Nonetheless, as I said, I stand by that story. I think it's a good story. Remember, the attack at the Y, quote unquote, was a bit. The story was not about that bit. I didn't know your letter was truncated. Sorry, here's a question. Would you feel differently about the story if it came out now at a time when gay relationships spanning the spectrum of the human condition, from wonderful to otherwise, are frequently portrayed on mainstream media? If it came out now, at a time when gay relationships spanning the spectrum of the human condition, from wonderful to otherwise, are frequently portrayed on mainstream media. Just one more thing. Never, when this subject has been raised, has anyone expressed any concern for or interest in the real life victim. Never a quote unquote, was he hurt? Or a quote, that must have been terrifying, unquote, or a quote, was he traumatized, unquote. Does no one care? I've made plenty of faulty judgments in my life, some of them in the Hulk story in question. I bet you've made a few too. I can assure you of this. There was no malice, no prejudice, and no ill intent, unquote. Now, this is Avi's response to what we just read from the looks of it. From that, I can tell if Shooter was apologizing for anything, it was changing a crude word to something he thought less crude. That's probably the only thing to be dismayed at. But with that noted, if a Muslim had published a story deemed anti-gay, would Mr. Mangles and Clarice have kept quiet? Yeah, because it is kind of funny how a lot of these LGBT activists get up in arms when it's a white conservative Christian who does this kind of thing. But in the Muslim world, if there is anybody who would be quote unquote anti-gay, it'd be Muslims. Okay. They would take it even further. So, but yet a lot of times you see a lot of these LGBT activists hand in hand with Muslims, hating on conservatives. So go figure. In sharp contrast to this case. Sadly, the chance of that is quite likely. So what's their point? No wonder the whole appalling idea of classism, quote unquote, has become so common. But, as is also noted in the article, when Shooter oversaw the Valiant brand, there were stories involving gay characters. Seriously, did he have to go to such lengths just to, quote unquote, prove he's not what they accused him of? Nope. And on that note, there's also this puff piece, which, as some may realize, is bound to be, quote unquote, clickbait, something Bleeding Cool's writers certainly seem to love doing. But if true, suggests Shooter regrettably wasn't above doing something icky. In Avi's opinion, of course. In 2007, the late Jim Shooter returned to DC Comics to write The Legion of Superheroes, again after 31 years. However, the run was heavily edited and truncated, with the final issue having no declared winner. Just Jim Shooter saying it wasn't his draft that was published. Years later, he would run his original pitch document, and in the light of certain statements made about Shooter on his passing, it is interesting to see that one of the scenes cut by DC Comics from the final issue would have established the Legionnaire's invisible kid, usually portrayed as a young man, as a trans woman. The Invisible Kid, Lyle Norg, was originally created by Jerry Siegel and Jim Mooney for Action Comics number 267 in 1960. Jim Shooter originally wrote the character back then, along with the rest of the Legion. The character was revealed to be gay in the back matter decades later, in a relationship with Kondo Arlick, Chemical King, but never really fully up on the page. So that's from the article, from the, I guess, Bleeding Cool article. And now this is Avi's response to that statement. It's just like a shoddy writer of Rich Johnston's sort to use illogical language like reveal, quote unquote, instead of established, quote unquote, or quote unquote, canonized in description of a fictional character. And just like him, to insult the memory of Superman's co-creator for the sake of this puff piece. Johnston presents the following, allegedly from a pitch draft about Invisible Kid, which says, quote, this is from the Bleeding Cool article, quote, Invisible Kid's new body is really new. He is now a she, a girl, and a hot one at that. Invisible Kid arranged with B5 to borrow gender factors from another encoding to change him. The outside, the sheath of flesh, is different, but the inside, the little kid's essence, mind, spirit, whatever, is as it always was. And now, the outside matches the inside better. Call her stealth or covert. She looks sort of like, a lot like Gazelle. And here's Avi's response to that. Now, I don't know if this is the real deal when it comes to script pitches and drafts. But this is still as embarrassing as it sounds. And lest we forget, Shooter, as noted before, once made a condescending remark about Dream Girl, an example. So coupled with all of the above, it wouldn't be surprising if he really was willing to pander to the perverse, sadly enough. Just because this is sci-fi, that makes it instantly acceptable? Nope. At least in Avi's opinion there. Now, if we were to bring up something more positive about Shooter, here's what writer D.G. Chichester had to say about his experiences. Jim always treated me graciously and professionally. His sense of humor stood out, too. When everyone at Marvel were learning to juggle, I noticed Jim's fumbling efforts and suggested juggling for a complete klutz, earning a priceless look from Archie Goodwin, but laughter from Jim himself. Two particular professional interactions with Jim were especially meaningful. When I finished that spring stint at Marvel, I would be going home for summer since I had another job lined up and still had schooling to finish at NYU. During that spring fling, Among my other tasks, I'd taken on some grunt editorial work on Bernie Wrightson's graphic novel Hooky, a Spider-Man meets monster riff. That summer, out of the blue, I received a bonus check for that additional work signed by Jim Shooter. Whether via Lynn or Jim himself, there was recognition that I'd gone above and beyond. That few $100s meant a lot at that point and warned me to up to Marvel. Even more when they later extended an offer to me to return in the fall as an assistant editor at Epic. Epic, of course, is one of Marvel's imprints. Huh. Hi, Mike. This new laptop I got has been giving me problems, hence the lack of activeness. But hope you're well. Well, thank you, Netsuri. You just happened to come in at a time when I'm, of course, covering an article about Jim Shooter and about him being accused of being homophobic for a story he did back in 1980 for Hulk number 25, in which Bruce Banner was basically going to be arped by a pair of homosexuals. But again, you can go back and if you want to stick around, that's fine too. But you can also go back and go over article again, because I do keep my streams up usually. If you want to go back and watch it again and see where. But thank you for popping in. It's nice to see you again. Anyways, getting back to the article here. So from what Chichester says further, it sounds like New World acquisition put the kibosh on the possibility he could get the job, since they undoubtedly were responsible for Shooter's dismissal. And to be sure, it can be validly argued whether being bought by what was then a corporate-owned studio hurt Marvel more than helped. Even though it was actually years later, when they were bought by Disney, that things began go even more south than before. This is definitely also the situation with DC, as owned by Time Warner today. So this is all, of course, Avi's opinion here. And to finish this article off here, this last statement, as I said before, of course, Shooter was bound to have been a divisive figure. But no less troubling are ideologues who feel entitled to properties they didn't create. And if Stan Lee was willing to stand behind Shooter on his Rampaging Hulk storyline, one must rightfully wonder if they're already turning against him too. Yeah, I'd have to say so, because by today's standards, Stan would probably be considered at the very least moderate, if not conservative. Heck, JFK, John F. Kennedy Jr., JFK Jr., former President Kennedy, would probably be considered at best, at least moderate, if not full-on conservative, by today's liberals, by today's hard left. So Let's see. One must rightfully wonder if they're already turning. Yeah, okay. But then, isn't that why they do well to stop obsessing themselves over companies and characters they didn't create? They didn't like the way they were originally structured. I think it's high time for some common sense, some common sense sunk in. Yeah, I think no matter what genre, whether or what field of media, whether it's anime, cartoons, comics, manga, even pro wrestling. I think people are tired of outsiders who think they know better coming in and trying to change what's been long established just to you know just to satisfy a very loud vocal minority. Um, Anyways, any more there? Nope. All right. So with that being said, that was the only article I was going to do tonight. So we've done that. So now let's kind of go through real quick, get over to the wrestling wrap up, as we do have quite a bit go over there. Try to get through that as quickly as possible. Because it did take me almost a whole hour here just to read this particular story here. So, anyways, so first off, we're gonna look back to last night's happenings from TNA Impact and Ring of Honor, and look ahead to tonight's SmackDown and tomorrow night's Collision, and then and then of course we'll probably talk about Slammiversary as well when we look at Impact here, because last night was of course the go home Impact before go home Impact before Slammiversary. So on last night's show, in preparation for his upcoming X Division title defense at Slammiversary, Moose defeated Sami Callihan in a one-on-one match. Of course, Alicia Edwards in his corner. Then you saw the rest of the system: Brian Myers, Eddie Edwards, and JDC go to a no contest with Order 4 members Mustafa Ali in the great hands of Jason Hotch and John Schuyler. Tessa Blanchard, in her preparation for her upcoming match against Indy Hartwell, defeated Danny Luna. And in a prelude to the main event for Slammiversary, the three-way match for the TNA Knockouts, the three-way for the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. Joe Hendry and Mike Santana got some much-needed momentum going up against by defeating TNA World Champion Trick Williams and Frankie Kazarian. So that happened on, of course, last night's Impact. Now moving, of course, ahead to we're going to mention a bit here about what's going on this Sunday for Slammiversary. The final card, a final card for the pay-per-view itself for the Sunday Slammiversary. Of course, the Sunday's Slammiversary will be coming from the UBS Arena in Elmont, New York. The event will, of course, open up with a singles match, a knockout singles match between Tessa Blanchard and Indy Hartwell. They'll be squaring off. And a match for the TNA Knockouts World Tag Team Championship. The current champions, the Elegance brand of Ash and Heather by Elegance, personal concierge in their corner, will be taking on former Knockouts World Champions Inspiration of Cassie Lee and Jessie McKay, who recently made their return to TNA. In a one-on-one match, two former rivals from WWE will clash. as Mustafa Ali and Cedric Alexander will be taking each other on. In a four-way ladder match for the TNA World Tag Team titles, the TNA World Tag Team Champions, the Nemeths, Nick and Ryan Nemeth, will be taking on the Hardys, Jeff and Matt Hardy, the Rascals, Trey Miguel and Xavier Wentz, and First Class, AJ Francis and Casey Navarro. As we previously mentioned, Moose will be defending the X Division title against the youngest in charge, Leon Slater. Leon Slater looks to become the youngest ever X Division champion, eclipsing the Amazing Reds record. And then in a match, in a winner take all type match for the TNA Knockouts and NXT Women's Champion, NXT Women's Champion JC Jane will be taking on Masha Slamovich, the TNA Knockouts champion. And, of course, JC Jane's corner is the remaining members of Fatal Attraction, Pamela Henley and Jasmine Nick. Backing up Masha Slamovich will be Lady Lee and Zaya Brookside. And then, as also previously mentioned, in the three-way match for the TNA World title, NXT superstar Trick Williams will be taking on former champ Joe Hendry, and as part of course, Joe Hendry's rematch clause from his contract, and Mike Santana. So now, also happening last night was Ring of Honor, Ring of Honor's Honor Club, which would be considered the kind of the fallout from the 125th episode of Ring of Honor Club, coming from the Curtis Colwell Center in Garland, Texas, with Caprice Coleman and Ian Riccaboni on commentary. Opening match on last night's Ring of Honor show saw former Ring of Honor World Television Champion Elias Jr. defeat Lee Johnson, who had Blake Christian in his corner. Diamante recently coming back and defeating Lady Frost at the 0 hour pre-show from this last Friday's Supercard of Honor. Continued her winning ways since her return, defeating Maya Young in just under 2 minutes. Jay Lethal defeated Rev Pro in a non-title match. Rev Pro's undisputed British heavyweight title, British heavyweight champion Michael Oakley, who had Amira in his corner. And then main event saw CMLL's Hechicero, also a member of the Don Callis family, with Rocky Romero in his corner, defeating Angelico of the Spanish Announce Project. So there we go for last night. Now let's look ahead to tonight and tomorrow night, as we will first off look ahead to tonight's SmackDown. Of course, the SmackDown brand with its follow-up to last week's happenings of Saturday night's main event and Sunday's Evolution pay-per-views. As we look ahead to tonight's SmackDown. All right. So tonight's SmackDown is coming from, on the USA Network, it's coming from Fort Bank Center in San Antonio, Texas. No matches have been announced yet for tonight's SmackDown. That's unfortunate, but there will obviously will be happenings, and we will talk about that more on Monday, of course, as of course the fallout from last weekend's events, Saturday night's main event and Sunday's Evolution pay-per-view. So now we'll we'll look ahead to tomorrow night's Collision. And on tomorrow night's Collision, AEW Collision, coming from the Byline Bank Oregon Ballroom in Chicago, Illinois. Tyra Valkyrie with her husband Johnny TV, as well as Mason Mansour of the M&M collection, be in her corner to take on Alex Windsor, who made her recent debut in AEW after having been signed about a month ago. Will have her second match, her first singles match in AEW. We'll see how that all pans out. Ricochet will be taking on AR Fox in what should promise to be a high-flying extravaganza. Megan Bayne takes on Ty Mello, a continuation of her feud with her and Anna Jay. In a four-way match, in a $20,000 four-way match, where the winner will win $200,000 four-way tag team match. Big Bill and Brian Keith will be taking on the Guns, Austin Colton Gunn, the Gates of Agony, Bishop Khan and Toa Leona, and the crew of Action Andretti and Leo Rush. Kyle O'Reilly of Paragon and the Conglomeration will be taking on Max Caster. 1/3 of the AEW World Trios champions, Katsuyori Shibata, will be taking on Rush of LFI. And in an 8-man tag team main event, Ring of Honor World Champion Bandito teams with Mascara Dorada and the team known as Jet Speed of the Jet Kevin Knight and Speedball Mike Bailey. Will be taking on the Don Callis family members of Josh Alexander, Lance Archer, Hechicero, and Rocky Romero. So with all that being said, that's all I got for the wrestling wrap-up. So now we will go ahead and with today being Friday, July the 15th, 2025. Let's take a look back at this day in Nietzsche history. So, first I'm going to head back 25 years ago. And on this date, 25 years ago, back in the year 2000, the final episode of HBO's Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales for Every Child, as of course narrated by Robert Guillaume of Benson fame, aired its final episode on this date back in 2000. On this date back in 2000, HBO's Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales for Every Child, aired its final episode on this date back in the year 2000, 25 years ago today. Moving ahead to the year 2001, 24 years ago today. On this date, 24 years ago today, the 50th issue of Archie and Friends went on sale on newsstands on this date back in 2001. It sold for $1.99, 32 pages, of course, featured such stories as Josie, I'm Going to Josie Land Part 1, Josie of Josie and the Pussycats fame, Reggie in Reggie's stand-up comedy corner, Dixon Dolly in Daffy Inventions, and Archie wrapping it up with Bring Your Own Barbecue and swing music. So the 50th issue of Archie and Friends went on sale on this date back in the year 2001. Let's see. All right, so moving on to the year 2010, which was 15 years ago today. On this date, 15 years ago today, the year 2010, WWE held its Money in the Bank pay-per-view on this date back in 2010. Held it from the Sprint Center in Kansas City, Missouri. In which, the main event for the Money in the Bank saw Sheamus defeat John Cena in a steel cage match to retain the WWE Championship. In an 8-man Money in the Bank ladder match, The Miz defeated Edge, Randy Orton, Chris Jericho, Evan Bourne, Ted DiBiase Jr., John Morrison, and Mark Henry to become the Raw Money in the Bank winner. Let's see. Layla retained the WWE Women's Champion over Kelly Kelly. Kane defeated Rey Mysterio Jr. in just under a minute to become the new World Heavyweight. Well, okay, so Kane won the SmackDown 8-man Money in the Bank ladder match, which he defeated Big Show, Matt Hardy, Kofi Kingston, Christian, Cody Rhodes, Dolph Ziggler, and Drew McIntyre. Then Rey Mysterio retained the World Heavyweight Championship over Jack Swagger. Then Kane decided to cash in his Money in the Bank and defeated Rey Mysterio for the World Heavyweight Championship. So I should have probably done the Hart Dynasty of Tyson Kidd and David Hart Smith defeated the Usos to retain Jay and Jimmy Uso to retain the WWE Unified Tag Team Championships, and Alicia Fox retained the Divas Championship over Eve Torres. There we go with that one. With that card. So now, moving on finally to the year 2015, 10 years ago today. On this date, 10 years ago today, as soon as I pull that up. Premiering in Japanese theaters on this date back in 2015, 10 years ago today. The 18th Pokemon movie and the second of the XY series. Let's see. In the States, known as Pokemon the Movie, Hoopa and the Clash of Ages, premiered in Japanese theaters on this date back in 2015. Pokemon the Movie, Hoopa and the Clash of Ages premiered on this date back in 2015. Also on this date in 2015 in Japan. Meiji Tokyo Renka the Movie, Serenade of the Crescent Moon, premiered in Japanese theaters on this date back in full term being Geki Joban Meiji Tokyo Renka Yumihari no Serenade, or Meiji Tokyo Renka the Movie, Serenade of the Crescent Moon, premiered on this date, basically based on the visual novel Meiji Tokyo Renka. On this date in 2015, 10 years ago today. All right, so with that being said, I thank everybody for being here tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. We're back this Sunday with more niche news. We're back this Sunday as my co-host this week will be the Metal from the Vomitorium, as we'll be looking back to comics that went on sale in June of 1940. We'll be focusing in on comics that went on sale from Dell, most notably Crack-a-Jack Funnies, number 25. So with that, I thank you all for being here tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. And I hope to see everybody back here on Sunday. Bye.